Jerusalem, one of the holiest places for all Abrahamic religions, is once again in the spotlight.
Jerusalem's Temple Mount, 35 acres of ancient stone sitting at the center of the world's most dangerous intersection. 3 religions call it holy. Billions of believers face it when they pray. Emperors fought wars to control it, and for more than a century, archaeologists have been desperate to dig beneath it. They can't. The thing nobody tells you is that this isn't just about respect or tradition. It's about survival. One misplaced shovel could trigger a conflict that makes previous wars look like minor disagreements. For Jews, this mount represents the foundation stone of creation itself, the exact spot where Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, where Solomon built the first temple in 957 BCE, where the Holy of Holies once contained the Ark of the Covenant. Here's the problem. After the Babylonians destroyed that temple, after the Romans demolished the second one, after 2,000 years of conquest and reconstruction, nobody knows precisely where the Holy of Holies actually stood. Walk on the wrong spot, and you've committed an unforgivable sacrilege. For Muslims, this same ground holds equal power. The Dome of the Rock marks where Muhammad ascended to heaven during the night journey. The Al-Aqsa Mosque serves as the third holiest site in Islam. An Islamic trust called the Waqf has guarded it for centuries. Any attempt to excavate looks like an attack on their faith. The political situation makes it worse. Israel controls security. The Waqf manages religious affairs. Every stone, every prayer, every footstep exists in a state of permanent tension. This is why, in 1867, when British officer Charles Warren arrived in Jerusalem, he knew the front door was locked tight. Warren worked for the Palestine Exploration Fund. His mission was simple but impossible: find physical proof of the biblical temples without touching the Temple Mount itself. So, he went under it. With rope, lanterns, and a small crew, Warren descended into ancient water shafts. He crawled through tunnels that hadn't seen daylight in millennia. The network beneath the city was vast. Cisterns, channels, passageways carved through bedrock. He discovered what's now called Warren's Shaft, a vertical tunnel some believe King David's soldiers used to infiltrate Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. Warren proved something crucial. A hidden world existed beneath the surface. A world that held secrets the stones above could never reveal. But even he hit the wall. The Temple Mount itself remained untouchable. Religious authorities made it clear: no digging, no exceptions. The risk was too great. That ban held for over 150 years. What many people don't realize is that the prohibition isn't just religious theater. It's backed by serious consequences. In 1996, when the Waqf opened an emergency exit for an underground mosque, the construction used bulldozers with zero archaeological supervision. The Israeli public erupted. Palestinians protested. Riots broke out. Dozens died. And that was just for an exit door. Imagine the chaos if anyone actually tried to excavate the mount itself. The layers beneath that ground represent every civilization that ever controlled Jerusalem. Israelite, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Crusader, Ottoman, British. Each layer tells a story. Each artifact could support one group's claim to the land while undermining another's. This is why archaeology stopped being a science here. It became a weapon. Every pottery shard is political ammunition. Every ancient coin is a land deed. Every temple stone is proof of ownership. So the Temple Mount sat, sealed, forbidden, guarded by faith and fear in equal measure. Its secrets seemed destined to stay buried forever. Then, in 1999, something happened that looked like a disaster but turned into the greatest archaeological opportunity in Jerusalem's history. The Waqf decided to renovate. They wanted to convert ancient underground spaces called Solomon's Stables into a larger mosque. The work required removing massive amounts of soil and rock. No archaeologists were consulted. No artifacts were documented. No supervision existed. At 400 truckloads of earth, priceless historical materials spanning 3,000 years, were hauled away like garbage and dumped in the Kidron Valley. When archaeologists found out, they were horrified. Centuries of history, mixed together and discarded. Irreplaceable evidence, lost forever. Or so it seemed. But what if that catastrophe opened a door? What if someone figured out how to study the Temple Mount without ever setting foot on it? What they discovered in that dumped soil would eventually lead to something far bigger, something that was waiting beneath the mount itself, something that rewrote the entire purpose of the world's holiest ground. The dumped soil sat in the Kidron Valley like a graveyard of forgotten history. 400 truckloads, thousands of tons, 3 millennia of Jerusalem's past, mixed together in piles of dirt and rubble. Most archaeologists wrote it off as a tragedy. The damage was done. The context was destroyed. In archaeology, context is everything. A coin found next to a particular style of pottery tells you when someone lived. A tool buried beneath a specific layer of ash tells you what happened during a fire. Strip away that context, and you just have random objects. But 2 archaeologists refused to accept defeat. Gabriel Barkay and Zaki Dvira looked at those piles differently. Yes, the soil had been ripped from its original location. Yes, the layers had been scrambled. But the artifacts themselves were still there, waiting, intact. The thing nobody tells you is that even mixed-up history is better than no history at all. In 2004, they launched something unprecedented, the Temple Mount Sifting Project. The concept was brilliantly simple. If they couldn't dig on the mount, they'd dig through what came from it. They set up an operation in Emek Tzurim National Park. Volunteers would pour buckets of the dumped soil onto large mesh screens. Water would wash away the dirt. What remained would be examined piece by piece. It was archaeological detective work on an impossible scale. And anyone could help. Families showed up on weekends. Tourists stopped by between visiting other sites. School groups brought children who'd never held a trowel. Elderly Holocaust survivors worked alongside teenagers. This wasn't some exclusive academic project. This was archaeology for everyone. The first finds came quickly. Ancient coins appeared almost immediately. Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Jewish. Each one a small metal window into a different era. Then came the pottery fragments. Thousands of them. Pieces of oil lamps that once lit homes 2,000 years ago. Remnants of cooking pots. Sections of large storage jars. Some fragments showed signs of intense heat, evidence of the fires that consumed Jerusalem when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE. But the real breakthroughs came when they started finding inscribed objects. Small clay seals called bullae began turning up. These seals were used to stamp documents and packages in ancient times. They bore names pressed into the clay before it was baked hard. Here's where things get stunning. Some of these seals carried names that appeared in the Bible. Priestly families mentioned in the book of Nehemiah, officials who served in the temple, real people who walked these grounds when Solomon's temple still stood. Suddenly, biblical history stopped being abstract stories on a page. These were physical objects held by actual human beings. One volunteer, a retired teacher from Belgium, found a small bronze shovel. It was an incense shovel used in temple rituals, the kind of implement priests would have carried during sacrifices and ceremonies. Another discovery stopped the entire operation for a day, a fragment of an ancient stone vessel. These vessels were used during the Second Temple period because stone, unlike pottery, couldn't become ritually impure according to Jewish law. Carved into this fragment was a single word in Hebrew, korban, sacrifice. This stone had been part of the temple's sacrificial system. It had been there when priests conducted their sacred duties, when pilgrims traveled from across the ancient world to worship. The Sifting Project uncovered game pieces, jewelry, arrowheads from multiple armies, glass from Byzantine windows, Crusader crosses, Ottoman buttons. Over the years, the count grew staggering. More than 500,000 artifacts, 500,000 pieces of history rescued from what should have been oblivion. Stone weights used by merchants, cosmetic tools used by women, dice used by Roman soldiers gambling while they guarded the temple. Each object was a voice from the past. Each fragment told a story that would have been lost forever. What many people don't realize is that these weren't just random trinkets. Patterns emerged. No, the sheer volume of First Temple period artifacts proved beyond doubt that a major complex stood on that mount during Solomon's era. The evidence was overwhelming. Fragments of columns, pieces of decorative architecture, building materials that matched the biblical descriptions. But here's what kept the archaeologists up at night. All these artifacts came from the surface layers, the stuff that had been moved and disturbed over centuries, the top of the archaeological cake. What about the deeper layers, the bedrock level where the original structures were built? That material was still there, still sealed, still forbidden. The sifting project had proven that extraordinary discoveries were possible, even with scrambled soil. Imagine what waited in the untouched layers below. The technology to see through solid rock existed. Our ground-penetrating radar had been used at other sites around the world. The AI to analyze that data was getting more sophisticated every year. Someone just had to be brave enough to point those scanners at the most sensitive piece of real estate on Earth. In 2021, someone was. What the AI saw in those scans would make the 500,000 surface artifacts look like a warm-up act, because deep below, in the bedrock itself, something waited that predated Solomon, predated David, predated everything the historical record acknowledged, and it was perfectly preserved. The team assembled in secret. No press releases, no official announcements, no permits that could be blocked by nervous politicians. Between 2021 and 2024, a group of scientists did what everyone said was impossible. They explored beneath the Temple Mount without moving a single stone. Their weapon was invisible radio waves. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, works on a principle that sounds like science fiction, but is surprisingly straightforward. You aim a device at the ground. It sends radio waves deep into the earth. Those waves travel until they hit something, a wall, a void, a different type of soil, a change in density. When they hit that something, they bounce back. A computer reads the returning signal, measures how long it took, calculates how deep the object sits, builds an image of what's down there. It's like an X-ray for the planet. The technology had already proven itself. Archaeologists used it to find hidden chambers in Egyptian pyramids, to locate buried Roman villas, to map ancient cities beneath jungle canopy. But the Temple Mount presented unique challenges. The ground above wasn't empty. Mosques, prayer halls, centuries of construction. All of it created interference. Background noise that could scramble the signal. This is where the AI changed everything. The thing nobody tells you is that GPR alone produces messy, confusing data. The images look like static on an old television, fuzzy, ambiguous, open to interpretation. But feed that data into an artificial intelligence system trained on thousands of archaeological scans. The AI learns to recognize patterns. It filters out noise. It spots anomalies that human eyes would miss. The team took it further. They obtained historical maps from the British Mandate period, survey drawings made in the 1920s and 1930s. These old documents showed known cisterns, tunnels, and ancient structures that British engineers had documented decades ago. The AI was fed this historical data alongside the new radar scans. Now it could cross-reference, compare. When the modern scans showed something that matched an old map, the AI marked it as verified, confirmed. When the scans showed something that appeared on no map, no historical record, no previous survey, the AI flagged it as an anomaly. The first scans ran in late 2021. The team worked at night. They used portable equipment that could be moved quickly. If anyone asked, they were conducting structural surveys for earthquake safety. Technically true, incredibly misleading. The initial results were encouraging. The radar picked up known structures perfectly. Ancient water channels appeared on screen exactly where the British maps said they'd be. Massive cisterns carved from bedrock showed up as dark voids. The system was working. Then they expanded the scan area. The AI began building a three-dimensional map of the subsurface, layer by layer, like peeling back the Earth digitally. First came the Ottoman layer, relatively recent, mostly rubble and fill from the 1500s. Below that, Crusader construction, rougher stonework, less sophisticated engineering. Deeper still, Byzantine architecture emerged. The scans revealed walls, corridors, archways, and then, at a depth that matched the late Byzantine or early Islamic period, the AI highlighted something. A small structure, isolated, tucked away in a corner that no historical map showed. The team ran the scans again. Same result. They checked for equipment malfunction. The machines were working perfectly. They examined the signal more closely. The radio waves showed defined walls, a curved ceiling, an arched entrance. This wasn't a natural formation. This wasn't random rubble. It was a chapel, a small Byzantine chapel sealed underground for nearly 1,600 years. The scans showed faint traces of what appeared to be carved crosses on the walls. The architecture matched known Byzantine Christian design. This was a place where early pilgrims had gathered to pray. But here's what made the team's blood run cold. The chapel wasn't built on bedrock. It was built on top of something else. Beneath its foundation, the radar detected massive cut stones. Perfectly rectangular, enormous, each one weighing several tons. The style was unmistakable. Ashlar masonry, the same technique used in ancient Israelite construction. These stones predated the chapel by 1,000 years. They came from the First Temple period. The AI measured them, calculated their dimensions, compared them to other known ancient structures. The match was precise. These stones were contemporaneous with Solomon's temple. The team had just confirmed that major construction from the 10th century BCE existed deep beneath the mount, exactly where the Bible said it would be. For a moment, the scientists thought they'd found what they were looking for, physical evidence of Solomon's architectural ambitions. But the AI wasn't finished analyzing the data. As it processed deeper layers, as it filtered more noise, as it cross-referenced every anomaly, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that appeared beneath the ancient stones, beneath the Byzantine chapel, beneath the First Temple foundations, the oldest layer, the bedrock level. Something was carved into the living rock itself, something that predated everything they'd found. And when the AI finally rendered the image clearly, when the team saw what the radio waves had detected, the room went silent. Because what they were looking at wasn't a temple. It was something else entirely. Something older than Solomon, older than David, older than the written word. And it had been sealed deliberately. Question was simple but terrifying. What were the ancients trying to hide? Water is survival in the desert. Jerusalem sits on a ridge in the Judean hills. No natural river flows through it. No lake sits nearby. For any city to exist here for thousands of years, water had to be engineered. The ancient inhabitants knew this. They became masters of hydraulic engineering. Charles Warren discovered this back in the 1860s when he explored those dark shafts beneath the city. He found elaborate tunnel systems designed to bring water from the Gihon Spring into the fortified areas. These weren't simple ditches. They were sophisticated networks with flow control, storage capacity, and backup systems. But what the AI revealed in 2023 made Warren's discoveries look like a child's sandbox project. The scans detected a vast underground water system that dwarfed anything previously documented. Massive cisterns carved directly from bedrock, some large enough to hold hundreds of thousands of gallons, channels connecting them in a carefully planned network. Aqueducts that shouldn't exist, according to the historical timeline. Here's what made the team stop and recalculate everything. The system showed signs of multiple construction phases, different techniques, different eras, as if generations of engineers had expanded and modified an original design over centuries. The AI mapped the flow patterns, traced how water would have moved through the channels, identified control points where ancient engineers could regulate pressure and volume. The sophistication was staggering. One section showed a settling tank system. Water would flow into a first chamber where sediment would drop out. Then cleaner water would flow into a second chamber, then into a third. This was advanced filtration, the kind of engineering that historians insisted didn't exist until much later. But the mineral deposits told the truth. When the team analyzed the chemical signatures in the scan data, they could detect calcium buildup on the channel walls, the kind that accumulates over centuries of water flow. They dated those deposits using spectral analysis techniques. Some of the channels had been flowing during the First Temple period, confirmed, but others showed deposits that were older, much older. The thing nobody tells you is that water leaves a timeline. Every drip, every flow, every year of use adds microscopic layers of minerals. Read those layers correctly, and you can date when the system was built. Parts of this network dated back to the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, that's 2,000 years before Solomon, a full millennium before Abraham. Someone had engineered a massive water system on this mount when the pyramids of Egypt were still being built. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a simple hilltop. This wasn't a random location chosen for a temple later. This site had been important, crucial, for thousands of years before the first biblical events supposedly happened here. But why? The answer lay in the layout itself. The AI mapped every cistern, every channel, every control point. Then it rendered the entire system as a three-dimensional model. The team rotated the image on their screens, looked at it from the different angles, searched for the pattern, and then someone saw it. The whole system flowed toward a central point. Every channel, every cistern, every aqueduct eventually fed toward one specific location beneath the mount. Not for distribution, not for storage, for collection. All that water, all that engineering, all those centuries of construction and maintenance pointed to a single destination, a chamber at the deepest level. But here's what made no sense. The chamber wasn't designed to hold water. The scans showed no basin large enough for storage, no outlet for distribution. Instead, the water appeared to flow around it, like a moat, like a barrier. The channels encircled the chamber in a perfect ring. Water flowed constantly through this ring, creating a continuous loop. What many people don't realize is that ancient cultures often used flowing water in rituals of purification and containment. Moving water was believed to create a barrier that certain spirits or forces couldn't cross. The Romans did it, the Egyptians did it. Cultures across the ancient world incorporated water barriers in sacred and protective architecture. But this was different. This was massive. This was permanent. This wasn't symbolic protection. This was engineering on a scale that suggested real, physical containment. The AI detected something else in the water channels, traces of other minerals that didn't belong, elements that had been deliberately added to the water. Salt concentrations far higher than natural, copper deposits, silver residue. These weren't water purification additives. These were elements used in ancient binding and sealing rituals across multiple cultures. The water system wasn't just bringing life to a city. It was maintaining a barrier, a seal, a liquid wall around something that needed to be kept isolated. For 3,000 years, the water had flowed in an endless circle around that central chamber. The question that haunted the team became unavoidable. What needs to be surrounded by running water for 3 millennia? What could possibly require that level of constant, perpetual containment? The AI had shown them the barrier. Now they needed to see what it was protecting the world from, or protecting from the world. The scans went deeper, focused tighter, penetrated the bedrock beneath the water ring, and what appeared on their screens made the room temperature drop, because the central chamber wasn't empty. The image took hours to render. The AI processed layer after layer of radar data, filtered interference, sharpened edges, built a detailed model of what sat at the deepest level beneath the Temple Mount. When the final image appeared, nobody spoke. They were looking at something that shouldn't exist, a perfectly circular chamber, 10 feet in diameter, carved from a single piece of bedrock with precision that seemed impossible for ancient tools. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was its condition. No cracks, no erosion, no structural damage whatsoever. Jerusalem sits on a major fault line. Earthquakes have rattled this city for millennia. Historical records document devastating quakes in 31 BCE, 363 CE, 749 CE, and 1033 CE. Each one toppled buildings, collapsed structures, shattered stone. Yet this chamber showed zero earthquake damage. The walls were smooth, perfect, as if they'd been carved yesterday. The team ran the data through geological analysis programs. They modeled the seismic activity the region had experienced over 3,000 years. The chamber should have been destroyed multiple times over. It wasn't. The AI couldn't explain it. Neither could the geologists. The only conclusion was one nobody wanted to say out loud. Something about this chamber defied normal physics. But the chamber itself wasn't what made the lead scientist's hands shake as he zoomed in on the image. It was the entrance. The radar had detected a doorway on the northern side, not an opening, a sealed entrance. Stone blocks had been fitted into the doorway with such precision that the gaps between them measured less than a millimeter, the kind of masonry that requires modern diamond-cutting tools. Except this had been done 3,000 years ago, minimum. The thing nobody tells you is that ancient builders did achieve incredible precision at certain sites. The pyramids of Giza, Pumapunku in Bolivia, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. But those sites are mysteries themselves. Anomalies that don't fit the accepted timeline of human technological development. Now Jerusalem could be added to that list. The seal showed another disturbing feature. The stones weren't just fitted together. They'd been locked in place with a substance the radar identified as lead. Molten lead had been poured into the gaps, created an airtight seal, made the entrance completely impermeable. Lead wasn't used in normal construction. It was heavy, expensive, difficult to work with, but it was used in one specific context throughout the ancient world: containment. The Romans sealed cursed objects in lead boxes. The Egyptians used lead in tombs meant to trap dangerous spirits. Greek magical texts describe lead tablets used to bind and restrain supernatural forces. Lead was the ancient world's equivalent of a supernatural deadbolt. Someone had sealed this chamber with the most powerful containment material available to them. The AI detected something else: symbols carved into the stone blocks that formed the seal. The resolution wasn't perfect. The radar couldn't capture fine details like a photograph, but the patterns were clear enough: repeating geometric shapes, spirals, concentric circles, forms that appeared in protective and binding rituals across multiple ancient cultures. These weren't decorative, these were functional, part of the sealing mechanism. One of the team members, a specialist in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, recognized a specific pattern. She pulled up reference images from Mesopotamian tablets. The match was exact. These symbols appeared in Akkadian texts describing how to seal away the Watchers, beings of immense power that ancient cultures believed roamed the earth before the Great Flood. Biblical apocrypha, texts not included in the Standard Bible, mention these Watchers, angels who descended to earth and taught forbidden knowledge to humans, who were eventually imprisoned by divine command. Most scholars treat these stories as mythology, allegory, ancient fiction. But here were the symbols, carved in stone, sealing a chamber that predated written history. The team ran additional scans focused specifically on the sealed entrance. They increased resolution, adjusted frequencies. The AI processed the new data and flagged an anomaly. There was text on the door. Not symbols, not decorative patterns, actual writing. The script was ancient, Paleo-Hebrew, one of the oldest forms of written language in the region. Dating the script based on letter formation and style suggested it was inscribed sometime between 1200 and 900 BCE, right at the transition between the Bronze Age collapse and the early Iron Age, the period just before King David supposedly conquered Jerusalem. A linguistic specialist was brought in. She studied the scan images for 3 days, cross-referenced every letter form with known inscriptions from the period. The translation came back simple, direct, terrifying. 4 words in ancient Hebrew. Here, the warden stands guard. Not, here lies a king. Not, holy ground. Not, temple treasury. The warden stands guard, present tense, as if whoever wrote it expected the warden to still be there, still watching, still performing its function. Guarding what? Guarding against what? The team expanded the scans to image the interior of the chamber itself. What the radar revealed inside made the sealed door suddenly seem like a very good idea, because the chamber wasn't empty. Objects sat inside, arranged deliberately, positioned with purpose. And at the center of it all was something the AI couldn't quite classify, something that appeared organic on the scans, but couldn't be organic, not after 3,000 years sealed away from air, light, and life. Yet there it was, waiting in the darkness, perfectly preserved. The interior scan took 2 weeks to complete. The team had to adjust the radar frequencies multiple times. Something about the chamber's composition kept distorting the signal. It was as if the rock itself was interfering, blocking, resisting examination. But eventually, the AI compiled enough data to build a 3-dimensional model of the chamber's contents. What it showed defied every archaeological expectation. The chamber contained 7 objects, each one positioned with mathematical precision around the perimeter. 7 stone pedestals, evenly spaced, forming a perfect circle. On each pedestal sat a clay oil lamp, not unusual by itself. Oil lamps were common in ancient times. The sifting project had found thousands of fragments. But these lamps were different. The design was primitive, crude, earlier than anything found in the dumped soil from the mount. The AI analyzed the lamp shapes and compared them to databases of known ancient pottery. The closest matches came from the late Bronze Age, around 1400 to 1200 BCE. These lamps predated Solomon's temple by 2 to 3 centuries. They predated David's conquest of Jerusalem. They came from a time when the city was still called Jebus, when Canaanite tribes controlled the region. Here's what made no sense. Why would lamps from that era be sealed in a chamber that was already ancient when they were placed there? The answer suggested something chilling. The chamber had been opened at least once. Someone in the late Bronze Age had entered it, positioned these lamps, then resealed it. The ritual had been performed, the seal renewed. But the lamps weren't the most disturbing discovery. At the center of the circle, the radar detected a large basin, carved from a single block of stone, rough-hewn, primitive in construction compared to later Israelite stonework. The basin measured approximately 3 feet across and 2 feet deep. Inside it, the spectral analysis detected residue, chemical signatures that survived 3 millennia, sealed away from oxygen and moisture. The residue contained traces of ash, expected in a ritual basin where offerings might have been burned. But mixed with the ash were elements that stopped the team cold: lead, mercury, arsenic. These weren't accidental contaminants. The concentrations were too high, too deliberate. The thing nobody tells you is that these specific elements appear together in ancient texts describing binding rituals. Mesopotamian tablets detail procedures for containing demons. The instructions specify mixing certain metals with ash and blood, creating a compound believed to trap spiritual entities. Greek magical papyri describe similar formulas: lead for weight and anchoring, mercury for its strange liquid properties that seem to exist between solid and spirit, arsenic for its connection to death and the underworld. These were the ingredients of supernatural imprisonment. The basin in the chamber contained exactly this combination. Someone had performed a binding ritual here, a containment ceremony using the most powerful methods available in the ancient world. The AI detected something else in the basin: organic residue beneath the metallic compounds. Carbon dating of organic material through spectral analysis is imprecise, but the team got a rough estimate. And the organic material dated to approximately 3,200 BCE, 5,000 years old. That's older than the first Egyptian dynasty, older than Sumerian writing, older than anything that should exist at this site according to conventional history. But the basin and the lamps and the toxic residue weren't what made the lead scientist call an emergency meeting with Israeli government officials. It was the thing in the corner. The radar had detected it on the first scan but couldn't classify it. The AI kept flagging it as an error, an artifact of signal interference, but it appeared on every subsequent scan. Same location, same dimensions, same impossible properties. In the northeastern corner of the chamber sat an object approximately 4 feet tall. The density readings were wrong. Too low to be stone, too high to be wood or clay. The shape was vaguely humanoid, elongated, thin. But here's the part that violated every law of decomposition and decay. The spectral analysis detected organic compounds, carbon-based molecular structures, the chemical signature of biological material. After 3,000 years minimum in a sealed stone chamber, nothing organic should remain. No wood, no cloth, no leather, certainly no tissue. Everything should have degraded to dust or mineral deposits. Yet this object showed active organic signatures, as if it were somehow preserved, mummified by methods unknown. Or, and this was the thought that nobody wanted to speak aloud, as if it weren't entirely dead. One team member suggested it might be a statue. Ancient cultures created human-shaped figures from organic materials mixed with resins and minerals. They ran the data through databases of known ancient statuary. No matches. The proportions were wrong. The density distribution didn't match any known construction technique. And statues don't show thermal variation in sealed chambers. But this object did. The radar detected temperature differentials, microscopic, barely measurable, but present. The center of the object was 0.3 degrees warmer than the surrounding stone. Not enough to indicate life, not enough to suggest active metabolism, but enough to suggest something that wasn't entirely inert. The lead scientist made a decision. The scans would go no further. The data would be classified. Access would be restricted to a handful of government officials and religious authorities, because if word got out about what was sealed beneath the holiest ground on Earth, the consequences would be catastrophic. But secrets have a way of escaping, especially when they've been buried for 3,000 years. The inscription wasn't on the door. That was the first translation. Here, the warden stands guard. 4 words in Paleo-Hebrew carved into the sealed entrance. But when the team ran higher resolution scans of the chamber's interior walls, they found more text, much more. The writing covered almost every surface: walls, ceiling, even portions of the floor. It spiraled around the chamber in continuous bands, like layers of protection written in words instead of stone. The script was the same, Paleo-Hebrew, but the content was different. This wasn't a simple warning. This was a detailed set of instructions, procedures, protocols, a manual for something that should never be opened. The linguistic team worked around the clock. The resolution of the scans made translation difficult. Some letters were unclear. Some words had no modern equivalent. But the general meaning came through with horrifying clarity. The text repeated certain phrases over and over, repetition that suggested ritual importance, commands that couldn't be forgotten or ignored. The seal must never break. The lamps must never dim. The water must never stop. The warden must never sleep. Each phrase appeared dozens of times, carved at different heights, different positions, as if whoever wrote them wanted to ensure they'd be seen from every angle. But one section of text was different. On the western wall, directly opposite the sealed entrance, the writing changed style. The letters were larger, deeper, carved with more force. This section wasn't instruction. It was history. The translation came back fragmented. The ancient Hebrew used archaic grammatical structures that made precise translation difficult. But the core narrative was clear enough to send chills through everyone who read it. In the days before the king, before the city of peace, the watchers came down from the high places. They taught what should not be known. They made what should not exist. They opened doors that should remain closed. The text described beings that descended from mountains, or perhaps from the sky. The ancient word could mean either. These beings possessed knowledge that humans weren't meant to have. They taught metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, writing, all the foundational technologies that launched civilization. But they also taught darker things. The text mentioned binding of spirits, calling of shadows, opening of gates, magic, or what the ancient world understood as magic. The thing nobody tells you is that nearly every ancient culture has versions of this story. The Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki, gods who came from the heavens and gave knowledge to humanity. The Greeks told of the Titans, divine beings who were eventually imprisoned in Tartarus. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most versions of the Bible, describes the Watchers in detail. 200 angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and taught forbidden arts. According to Enoch, these Watchers were eventually bound and sealed away by the archangels until the final judgment. Most scholars treat these stories as mythology, or cultural memories of early teachers and innovators transformed into divine figures over time. But the inscription in the chamber told a different version. One Watcher would not return. One refused the binding. One remained when the others ascended. The text described a struggle, a confrontation, an entity that wouldn't leave voluntarily. The elders of Jebus sought the wisdom of the East. They learned the binding of lead and salt. They carved the protection into stone. They sealed the one who would not go. The timeline was becoming clear. Before Jerusalem was Jerusalem, when it was still the Canaanite city of Jebus, the inhabitants encountered something. Someone, an entity they couldn't defeat or expel. So they imprisoned it instead. They used every technique available to them: lead seals, saltwater barriers, protective symbols, ritualized warnings. They carved this chamber from bedrock, placed the entity inside, sealed it with materials and methods designed to last forever. And then they did something else. The inscription's final section described what happened next. A warden was chosen, one who would watch without sleeping, one who would guard without resting, one who would maintain the seal until the stars fall. The text didn't specify what the warden was: human, spirit, something created specifically for this purpose. But it made one thing abundantly clear: the warden wasn't temporary. This wasn't a guard shift that would end. This was an eternal assignment. And the warden was still there. That elongated figure the scans detected in the corner. The object with impossible organic signatures and microscopic thermal variations. That was the warden, still standing, still watching, still performing its function after 3,000 years minimum, possibly 5,000 years based on the organic residue in the basin. The inscription ended with a final warning. The words carved deepest of all: if the seal breaks, the warden falls. and the bound one wakes. The gates will open that should remain closed. What was cast out will return. What was ended will begin again. One team member, a religious studies scholar, recognized the phrasing. It echoed apocalyptic literature from multiple traditions: the opening of seals, the breaking of bonds, the return of what was imprisoned. These were end times scenarios. The team sat in silence after reading the complete translation. They'd been looking for Solomon's temple, for biblical archaeology, for historical artifacts. Instead, they'd found something that predated all of it, something that suggested the Temple Mount wasn't chosen randomly as a holy site. It was built on top of a prison, a containment facility, a seal holding back something that ancient cultures across the region believed would end the world if released. And that seal had been undisturbed for millennia, until now. Because the scans themselves might have been a mistake. The anomaly appeared 3 weeks after the final scans. A structural engineer reviewing the data noticed something strange. The radar readings from the chamber weren't stable. They were changing, not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious without careful comparison, but the measurements were different. The sealed door showed micro-fractures that hadn't been there in earlier scans, hairline cracks, barely visible but growing. The engineer ran the data through stress analysis software. The results made no sense. The stone was weakening. The molecular bonds in the rock were breaking down at an accelerated rate, as if something was aging the stone artificially. The lead scientist pulled all the scan data from the past 3 years. He compared each session, tracked the progression. The pattern was undeniable. The chamber had been perfectly stable before the first scan in 2021. The radar images showed no structural issues whatsoever. But with each subsequent scan session, minor changes appeared. The lead seal showed signs of degradation. The protective symbols on the door were becoming less distinct. Erosion that should take centuries was happening in months. Someone suggested it was coincidence, natural deterioration that happened to accelerate during the study period. But the timing was too precise. The chamber had remained intact through 3,000 years of earthquakes, weather, and geological shifts. Then humans aimed radio waves at it for 3 years, and it started falling apart. The thing nobody tells you is that radar isn't passive observation. It's active. It sends energy into the ground. That energy has to go somewhere. Most of it reflects back. But some gets absorbed by the materials it penetrates, converted to heat, vibration, molecular agitation. Usually this is negligible, harmless. The amount of energy involved is tiny. But the team had been scanning the same location repeatedly. There were hundreds of hours of accumulated exposure. And the chamber wasn't ordinary rock. The geological analysis had flagged unusual properties from the beginning. The stone's resistance to earthquake damage, its perfect preservation. What if those properties came from something other than natural geology? What if the chamber had been sealed not just physically, but energetically, protected by some method the ancients understood but modern science didn't recognize? One physicist on the team proposed a disturbing hypothesis. Ancient cultures across the world built structures aligned to specific frequencies. The Great Pyramid resonates at certain sound frequencies. Stonehenge shows acoustic properties. Temple complexes in India were designed around harmonic ratios. These weren't accidents. These were engineered features. What if the chamber beneath the Temple Mount was designed to maintain a specific frequency, a resonance that reinforced the seal? And what if the radar scans had disrupted that frequency? The team ran harmonic analysis on the chamber's dimensions. The results were striking. The circular shape, the 10-foot diameter, the depth below ground, the thickness of the walls. All of it created a natural resonance chamber tuned to a specific frequency in the extremely low range. Frequencies that humans can't hear but can feel. Frequencies that affect consciousness and perception. Ancient texts describe sacred spaces as places where the veil is thin, where the boundary between worlds becomes permeable. Modern research shows that certain low frequencies can induce altered states, hallucinations, feelings of presence, fear responses. The chamber was a precision instrument, built to maintain a specific vibrational state, and the radar had been pumping random frequencies into it for 3 years. The seal wasn't just breaking down physically, it was breaking down energetically. The protective resonance was being disrupted. A meeting was called. Government officials, military advisors, religious leaders from all 3 faiths. The lead scientist presented the findings, explained the degradation, showed the progression models. If the current rate continued, The microfractures in the door seal would become structural failures within 18 months. The lead that had held for 3 millennia would crack. The seal would break. The chamber would be exposed. One option was presented: stop all scanning immediately. Let the chamber stabilize. Hope the damage could self-repair over time. But the physicist pointed out a darker possibility. What if they'd already crossed a threshold? What if the disruption had triggered an irreversible cascade? The chamber might be like a dam with a small crack. Stop the pressure and it might hold. Or the crack might continue spreading regardless. There was no way to know without continued monitoring, but continued monitoring would guarantee further damage. They were trapped in an impossible choice. Watch the seal break and know it's happening, or stop watching and hope it doesn't. The religious leaders wanted the scans stopped immediately. The site should never have been examined in the first place. The scientists argued for minimal monitoring, just enough to track the degradation and develop intervention strategies. Or the government officials wanted the entire project classified and buried. While they argued, something else was happening. The warden was responding. The thermal signature that had been 0.3 degrees above ambient, it was rising, slowly, incrementally, but measurably, 0.4 degrees, 0.5, 0.6. As if whatever waited in that corner was waking up. The scans had done more than damage the physical seal. They'd done something to the warden itself. 3,000 years of perfect stillness, perfect execution of its eternal duty. Now something was changing. The temperature wasn't the only anomaly. The object's position had shifted. Not much. Millimeters. But in previous scans, it had been absolutely static. Now, it was moving. The electromagnetic properties around the chamber were fluctuating. The minerals in the surrounding bedrock showed altered magnetic signatures. Everything about the site was becoming unstable. And 6,000 miles away, someone else had noticed. Because the frequency disruptions weren't staying localized. They were propagating through the Earth itself. Seismographs in 3 countries had detected unusual vibrations originating from Jerusalem. Not earthquakes. Something else. Something rhythmic, like a heartbeat, coming from deep below the Temple Mount, getting stronger. The rhythmic vibrations created a problem nobody expected. Scientists monitoring seismic activity in Turkey, Jordan, and Cyprus all detected the same anomaly. A pulse originating from the coordinates of Jerusalem's old city. Frequency, 7.83 hertz. That number made the physicist on the team go pale. And 7.83 hertz is known as the Schumann resonance, the fundamental frequency of Earth's electromagnetic field, the planet's natural heartbeat. It's the frequency that all life on Earth evolved within, the background hum of existence itself. Ancient cultures didn't have instruments to measure it, but they knew it existed. They called it different things. The music of the spheres, the cosmic the frequency of creation. And somehow, impossibly, the chamber beneath the Temple Mount was resonating at exactly that frequency. Not approximately, exactly. The thing nobody tells you is that ancient builders possessed knowledge that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode the speed of light and the circumference of Earth. Göbekli Tepe shows astronomical alignments that shouldn't be possible for hunter-gatherers. Pumapunku features stonework that modern tools struggle to replicate. These weren't primitive people guessing randomly. They knew something, and whatever they knew, they used it to build the chamber. The team brought in an archaeoacoustic specialist, someone who studies the sound properties of ancient sites. She analyzed the chamber's dimensions using resonance modeling software. The results were precise and terrifying. The circular shape created a perfect acoustic cavity. Sound entering the chamber would reflect and reinforce at specific frequencies, but the chamber wasn't designed to amplify sound. It was designed to cancel it. The 7 lamps positioned around the perimeter, their placement wasn't decorative or symbolic. They were acoustic dampeners. When the specialist modeled how sound would behave with objects at those exact positions, the pattern became clear. The lamps would create interference nodes, dead zones where sound waves would cancel each other out. The chamber was an acoustic prison, designed to silence whatever was inside, not just prevent it from being heard, prevent it from using sound as a tool. Ancient magical traditions across multiple cultures describe sound as a creative force, words of power, divine speech that shapes reality. The Egyptian god Ptah created the world through spoken words. The Hebrew Bible describes God speaking creation into existence. Hindu texts detail the primordial sound Om from which all things emerged. If an entity possessed the ability to manipulate reality through sound or frequency, you'd need to silence it. The chamber did exactly that. But here's the problem. The scans had been pumping radio frequency energy into a precision-engineered acoustic dampening system. They'd been disrupting the very mechanism designed to keep the entity powerless. The specialist ran simulations, modeled what would happen if the dampening system degraded by 10%, 20%, 50%. At 30% degradation, the chamber would no longer suppress frequencies effectively. Whatever was sealed inside could begin projecting sound, or frequency, or whatever method it used to affect the world outside. The current degradation level? 27%. They were 3% away from critical failure. A second specialist was brought in, an expert on ancient Middle Eastern religious practices. He examined the inscription translations, studied the ritual objects, analyzed the binding materials. His conclusion was disturbing. The entire site wasn't just one seal, it was layers of seals, built over centuries by different cultures, each adding their own protections. The original Canaanite chamber and binding, the water barrier system added later, the lead seal from the early Israelite period, the protective inscriptions renewed multiple times, and finally, the temple itself. Solomon's temple wasn't built for worship alone, it was built as the final seal, a capstone on an ancient prison. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred chamber where God's presence dwelt, sat directly above the prison chamber. The daily rituals, the sacrifices, the prayers of thousands of priests over centuries, all of it was maintaining the seal, reinforcing it with spiritual energy, keeping the binding strong. When the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE, the seal weakened. The second temple, built 70 years later, restored it. When the Romans destroyed that temple in 70 CE, the seal weakened again. It was never fully restored. For 2,000 years, the site has operated with a compromised seal, weakened but holding, held together by the sheer accumulated weight of faith. Billions of prayers from 3 religions, all focused on the same ground: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all maintaining the seal without knowing it. The religious tension, the political conflict, the absolute prohibition on digging, all of it served a purpose. It kept people focused on the site, kept the spiritual energy concentrated. The specialist's voice was shaking as he delivered his conclusion. The fighting over this ground isn't a bug, it's a feature. The constant attention, the prayers, the devotion from multiple faiths, it's all maintaining a spiritual barrier around something that physical barriers alone can no longer contain. Someone asked the obvious question: what happens if that attention stops? What happens if the discovery becomes public and the site is abandoned out of fear? What happens if the 3 faiths stop maintaining their vigil? The specialist didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to a section of the ancient inscription that hadn't been fully translated. The linguistic team worked on it for 3 more days. The grammar was unusual, the vocabulary archaic, but the meaning finally became clear. When the watchers cease their watch, when the faithful abandon the mount, when silence falls over the holy ground, the bound one will speak, and what it speaks will reshape the world. The team realized they were looking at a fail-safe mechanism built into reality itself. The entity below couldn't break free through force. The physical and energetic seals were too strong, but it could manipulate, influence. Wait for humans to discover it. Wait for fear to drive them away. Wait for the spiritual attention to fade. Then it would have the silence it needed. And in that silence, it would speak. The frequency would propagate. The resonance would build. The gates would open. The team had done exactly what the entity needed them to do. They'd found it, documented it, created data that would eventually leak. The countdown had started. The classified report was 47 pages long. It contained everything: the scan data, the chamber dimensions, the inscription translations, the degradation timeline, the thermal anomalies, the seismic readings from 3 countries. 6 copies existed, each one numbered, each one assigned to a specific individual: government ministers, military intelligence chiefs, senior religious authorities from all 3 faiths. The lead scientist kept the original. For 11 days, the secret held. Then copy number 4 disappeared. The official who held it reported it missing on a Tuesday morning. His office showed no signs of forced entry. His secure safe had been opened with the correct combination. Someone who knew the code had taken it. An internal investigation started immediately. Access logs were reviewed. Security footage was examined. Nothing conclusive emerged. But 3 days after copy 4 went missing, fragments started appearing online. Not the full document, pieces. Screenshots of specific pages with identifying information removed. The scan images. Blurry, but recognizable. A circular chamber, a sealed door, objects arranged in a pattern. Portions of the inscription translation. 4 words that kept appearing in different forums and message boards. Here, the warden stands guard. The first posts appeared on obscure archaeology forums, small communities of enthusiasts who follow fringe discoveries and alternative history. The thing nobody tells you is that these communities have been waiting for exactly this kind of discovery their entire lives. Within hours, the posts were shared thousands of times. Within days, they'd crossed into mainstream social media. Within a week, 3 separate investigative journalists had contacted the lead scientist's institution asking for comment. The official response was silence. No confirmation, no denial, which in the world of journalism means exactly one thing. The story is real. 2 of the journalists dropped it. The legal and geopolitical complications were too dangerous. Publishing unverified claims about discoveries beneath the Temple Mount could trigger genuine international incidents. The 3rd journalist didn't drop it. She'd spent 15 years covering archaeology and religion in the Middle East. She understood the stakes better than anyone. She also understood that the story was too important to ignore. She spent 3 weeks verifying what she could. She tracked the seismic data independently, confirmed that geophysical monitoring stations in Turkey, Jordan, and Cyprus had recorded the unusual vibrations. She found a retired geologist who'd worked with the team peripherally. He wouldn't go on record, but he confirmed the basic facts. An unusual structure existed beneath the mount. The scans were real. The findings were genuine. He used one phrase that she couldn't get out of her head. The scientists who saw the full data aren't sleeping well. She published her story on a Thursday morning. By Friday, it was the most read article on 3 major news platforms. By Saturday, governments were responding. The Israeli Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling the reports speculation based on misrepresented technical data. The Waqf Islamic Trust issued a statement condemning what they called deliberate provocations designed to undermine the sanctity of the noble sanctuary. The Vatican released a 1-line statement, unusually brief for an institution that typically issues careful theological responses. The Church continues to pray for Jerusalem. 7 words. No elaboration, no denial, no theological framing. For those who understood Vatican communication, that silence was deafening. What many people don't realize is that the Vatican has one of the world's most extensive archives of ancient religious texts, documents that never became part of standard scripture. Apocryphal writings, ancient church fathers' commentaries on pre-biblical traditions. If anyone had historical context for what was sealed beneath the Temple Mount, it was Rome. And Rome was saying nothing. On the ground in Jerusalem, the reaction was immediate and dangerous. Groups of Jewish activists attempted to enter the Temple Mount, demanding access to the southern section nearest the reported chamber location. Palestinian groups organized counter-demonstrations. Israeli security forces deployed in numbers not seen since the Second Intifada. The fragile arrangement that had kept the peace for decades was fracturing in real time. 3 separate religious authorities issued competing claims within 48 hours. One Jewish rabbinical council declared the chamber was clearly the location of the Holy of Holies and demanded immediate excavation to retrieve the Ark of the Covenant. An Islamic religious body declared the entire story a fabrication designed to justify Israeli archaeological violations of sacred Muslim ground. A Christian evangelical organization declared the discovery confirmed end-times prophecy and called for immediate global prayer. 3 different narratives, 3 incompatible conclusions, all triggered by the same 47-page document. The entity below couldn't have engineered a better response if it had planned it, and according to the inscription, maybe it had. The bound one will not break free through force. It will speak through the minds of those above. It will use their fear and their faith and their conflict to weaken what holds it. The team's physicist looked at the seismic data as the protests erupted above the mount. The heartbeat frequency was stronger, more defined. The pulse that had been barely detectable 3 weeks ago was now registering clearly on monitoring equipment. Point 4's stronger, measurable increase, synchronized with the peak of the protests above, as if the conflict itself was feeding something below, as if the chaos and the fear and the competing claims were exactly what it needed. The lead scientist called an emergency meeting. He had new data that hadn't been in the original report, information the team had been sitting on, waiting to verify before including it in official findings. He could wait no longer. Because the new data changed everything they thought they understood about the chamber. The entity below wasn't just imprisoned there, it had been imprisoned there before. The binding inscription wasn't the original, it was a renewal, a second sealing performed over a much older one, which meant this had happened before. Something had nearly escaped, or had escaped, and had been caught and imprisoned again. The scars on the bedrock surrounding the chamber weren't geological, they were damage, blast patterns radiating outward from the chamber in all directions. Something had exploded out of that room with tremendous force at some point in ancient history. The dating of the blast damage corresponded to a specific period, around the 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse. The simultaneous fall of nearly every major civilization in the ancient world. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Canaanite city-states. Historians have never found a satisfying explanation for why so many powerful civilizations collapsed simultaneously within a few decades. Now there was a candidate, and it had been recaptured, resealed, imprisoned again beneath what would become Jerusalem. The lead scientist looked at his team, at the faces of people who'd spent years pursuing discovery and had found something they desperately wished they hadn't. He asked the question that none of them wanted to answer. If it escaped once and brought down the ancient world, what happens when it escapes again? Because the seal was at 31% degradation now, and climbing. The emergency meeting lasted 14 hours. Scientists, theologians, government officials, military advisors, all sitting in the same room trying to make sense of something that defied every framework they possessed. By the end, 3 distinct theories had emerged. 3 ways of understanding what was sealed beneath the Temple Mount. 3 conclusions that led to 3 completely different courses of action. And they couldn't all be right. But here's the terrifying part. They couldn't all be wrong either. The first theory was the most straightforward. Horrifying, but straightforward. Something real was imprisoned in that chamber. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. Physically, genuinely imprisoned. An entity that predated human civilization. That possessed capabilities modern science couldn't explain or categorize. The Bronze Age collapse provided supporting evidence that was difficult to dismiss. Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed within 50 years. The Sea Peoples appeared from nowhere and attacked Egypt. The Mycenaean palace economies dissolved overnight. The Hittite Empire vanished. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries simply stopped. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. They debate its causes endlessly. Climate change, earthquakes, internal rebellions, invasion. None of these explanations fully satisfy. The collapse was too widespread, too simultaneous, too complete. The blast damage around the chamber dated to exactly this period. The theory proposed a sequence of events. The entity escaped around 1200 BCE. It roamed free for some period. The simultaneous civilizational collapse reflected its influence, or its appetite. Then something stopped it, recaptured it, resealed it. The early Israelites arriving in Canaan brought knowledge from Egypt, from the wilderness, from encounters with forces that the biblical record describes, in careful, guarded language. The thing nobody tells you is that early Hebrew texts contain detailed protocols for dealing with non-human entities, prayers of binding, rituals of containment, instructions for maintaining seals. This knowledge wasn't invented, it was learned from experience. The Israelite priests who maintained the temple weren't just performing worship rituals, they were prison guards, performing daily maintenance on a supernatural containment system. The implications of this theory were devastating. If it was true, the entity was real, physical, present, and 31% closer to freedom than it had been 3 years ago. The only course of action was immediate intervention. Somehow reinforce the seal, restore the acoustic dampening, restart the water barrier. But nobody knew how. The second theory agreed on the basic facts but interpreted them differently. The chamber wasn't a prison. It was a door, a stable wormhole, a dimensional interface, a point where the physics of this reality connected to something else. The entity wasn't imprisoned there, it lived there. The chamber was its natural habitat, its home dimension bleeding into ours at a specific geographic point. The ancient builders didn't capture it. They contained the doorway. This theory explained the Schumann resonance connection. The chamber resonated at the frequency of Earth's electromagnetic field because it was tethered to Earth's deepest energetic structures. It explained the perfect preservation of the chamber. Physics works differently at dimensional interfaces. Time doesn't behave normally. It explained the thermal anomaly in the Warden figure. The object wasn't warming up because something inside it was waking. It was warming up because the dimensional membrane was thinning. Energy from the other side was bleeding through. What many people don't realize is that quantum physics actually allows for this. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests infinite parallel realities exist simultaneously. And the mathematics of string theory requires additional dimensions beyond the four we experience. These aren't fringe ideas. These are mainstream theoretical physics. What if ancient cultures discovered a location where those additional dimensions became accessible, where the boundary between realities was thin enough to interact with? The gateway theory suggested that the temple rituals weren't maintaining a prison. They were regulating a dimensional aperture, keeping it stable, preventing uncontrolled breaches. The course of action under this theory was completely different. Don't try to strengthen the seal. Study the gateway, understand its properties. Learn to control access rather than simply blocking it. The potential knowledge available through a genuine dimensional interface would be unprecedented. Here, the physicist found this theory compelling, scientifically coherent, potentially revolutionary. The theologians found it deeply disturbing for completely different reasons than the prison theory. The third theory was the most unsettling of all, not because of what it said about the chamber, but because of what it said about humanity. There was nothing in the chamber. The chamber was real. The seals were real. The inscription was real. The degradation was real. But the thing being contained wasn't an external entity. It wasn't an imprisoned being from another dimension. It was a reflection. Ancient cultures understood something about collective human consciousness that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. Concentrated negative energy, accumulated fear, rage, violence, the psychic residue of thousands of years of human conflict. This energy doesn't just dissipate, it accumulates, concentrates. In certain locations, under certain conditions, it develops coherence. It becomes something, not a being with intelligence and intention, but a force, a pressure, a potential energy waiting to discharge. The chamber beneath the Temple Mount sits at the geographic center of millennia of human conflict, the most fought over ground in history. Every war, every massacre, every act of religious violence performed in the name of the holy ground above. All of that energy had to go somewhere. The ancient builders recognized what was accumulating. They didn't know what it was scientifically, but they felt its presence. They understood its danger, so they built a container for it, a spiritual pressure vessel. The inscription warnings weren't about a living entity. They were about the accumulated darkness of human violence, a force that would be catastrophic if released all at once. The warden figure in the corner wasn't a supernatural guardian. It was a symbolic representation, a psychological anchor, an icon placed there to give form to an abstract concept, making it easier to maintain the containment through focused ritual and intention. The thermal anomaly, the rising temperature, the movement caused by the protests erupting on the surface above. Every act of conflict and violence on the Temple Mount was adding energy to whatever was stored in that chamber. And with the discovery now public, with protests and counter-protests and international conflict erupting around the site, that energy was building faster than ever. So this theory was in some ways more terrifying than the others, because it meant humanity was the threat. The thing sealed beneath the most contested ground on Earth was made entirely of human darkness, and humans were feeding it every single day. The meeting ended without consensus. 3 theories, 3 action plans, 3 incompatible worldviews. The only point of agreement was this: the degradation had to stop. But stopping it required access to the chamber. Access that would require unprecedented cooperation between groups that had been in conflict for centuries. Jewish archaeologists, Islamic religious authorities, Christian scholars, Israeli government, Palestinian leadership, all working together on the same project for the same goal. The most politically impossible collaboration in human history. One government advisor looked around the room and said what everyone was thinking. If we can't figure out what's down there, at least we know one thing for certain. He paused. The worst possible outcome isn't the seal breaking. Another pause. The worst possible outcome is the wrong people finding out first. 3 days later, someone did. The group had no official name. They didn't need one. They'd been watching the Temple Mount for 30 years, waiting for exactly this moment, preparing for a discovery that most people dismissed as fantasy. They weren't governments. They weren't academics. They weren't affiliated with any recognized religious institution. They were 12 people with enormous resources, deep connections, and a singular obsession. They believed the chamber wasn't a threat. They believed it was an opportunity. The leaked document had reached them within hours of going missing, before the journalist published her story, before the protests began, before the governments started issuing statements. They'd had a 3-week head start, and they'd used it well. 2 members held senior positions in private construction companies with active contracts on Temple Mount infrastructure projects, maintenance work, structural assessments, routine repairs to drainage systems, legitimate access, official permissions, hard hats and clipboards. The thing nobody tells you is that the most dangerous people in any situation aren't the ones forcing their way in. They're the ones who are already invited. Their plan was straightforward in concept, extraordinarily complex in execution. Using the existing drainage maintenance access points, they'd identified a route that came within 40 feet of the chamber's location. 40 feet of solid bedrock between them and the most significant discovery in human history. They weren't planning to break the seal. They were smarter than that. They wanted a sample, something small, a fragment of material from the sealed door, enough to analyze independently, enough to understand what they were dealing with before anyone else could intervene. The physicist who'd worked on the original team had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. A resignation letter cited personal reasons. His colleagues found it unconvincing. A man who'd devoted his career to this discovery didn't walk away from personal reasons. He walked away for professional ones. He was working for them now. His resonance frequency data was invaluable. He knew exactly how the chamber's dampening system worked. He understood the precise frequencies the radar had disrupted. And he believed the gateway theory completely. He wasn't trying to contain the chamber. He was trying to open it, carefully, scientifically, in a controlled manner, but open it nonetheless. The Israeli intelligence service Shin Bet became aware of the group's existence on a Wednesday afternoon. An informant within one of the construction companies reported unusual requests, specific questions about drainage tunnel layouts, about the depth of certain access shafts, about maintenance schedules and security rotations. Shin Bet had been monitoring the Temple Mount situation since the first leak. They'd been coordinating with Jordanian intelligence, which maintains significant involvement in Jerusalem's Islamic holy sites. Both agencies understood what was at stake, not just archaeologically, not just religiously, geopolitically. If a private group accessed that chamber before any official body could establish protocol and control, the consequences would be unmanageable. Every government in the region would demand access. Every religious authority would claim jurisdiction. Every intelligence service would want the data. The scramble for control over whatever was in that chamber could destabilize the entire Middle East faster than any military conflict. A joint operation was authorized. Israeli and Jordanian intelligence working together on sovereign Israeli territory. For those who understand Middle Eastern geopolitics, that cooperation alone was historic. The 2 agencies had quietly collaborated on specific security matters for decades, but never anything this visible, never anything this significant. The joint operation moved quickly. Surveillance was established on all 12 members of the group. Their communications were monitored, their movements tracked. Within 48 hours, the full plan was mapped. What many people don't realize is that intelligence operations of this nature rarely result in dramatic arrests or confrontations. The goal isn't to catch someone doing something. The goal is to prevent them from doing it at all. Key logistics were disrupted quietly. A maintenance contract was quietly cancelled. A security rotation was subtly changed. An access permit was delayed in bureaucratic processing. The group's window of opportunity closed without them ever knowing it had been shut. But the physicist was the problem. He'd gone completely off the grid. No phone, no digital footprint, no known location. He had all the frequency data in his head. He didn't need access to the original scans. He'd memorized the key parameters before leaving, and frequency disruption didn't require physical access to the chamber. You could theoretically target the right frequencies from outside, from the surface, from anywhere within range that had a clear line to the ground. The degradation of the chamber seal could be accelerated remotely. If someone wanted to open that door without physically touching it, they had everything they needed. The question was whether the physicist had already started. The seismic monitoring data provided an answer nobody wanted. The heartbeat frequency had changed. Previously, it had been building gradually, incrementally increasing as the seal degraded naturally. Now it was spiking, sharp increases followed by brief plateaus. Then another spike. Not natural degradation, induced resonance disruption. Someone was actively targeting the chamber's frequency from an external location. The seal degradation counter jumped from 31% to 38% in 72 hours, a rate of increase that compressed the remaining timeline dramatically. The physicist wasn't just somewhere out there thinking about it, he was already doing it. The Shinbet analyst running the operation looked at the degradation data and did a quick calculation. At current acceleration rate, the seal would reach critical failure in 11 days. 11 days before whatever was in that chamber was exposed to the world. 11 days to find one man with no digital presence, no known location, and a head full of the most dangerous knowledge on the planet. 11 days before the seal that had held for 3,000 years finally gave way. The operation went to its highest alert level. Every resource was committed, every contact activated. And then the lead scientist received a message that changed the entire equation. It came from an anonymous source, encrypted, untraceable. 4 words. The warden is awake, followed by coordinates. Not the location of the physicist, the coordinates of something else entirely. Something that had been dormant for 3,000 years. Something that was now moving toward the surface. All of the coordinates led to a construction site in East Jerusalem, 3 miles from the Temple Mount. A routine apartment building project that had been running behind schedule for months. The workers had been complaining about equipment malfunctions, drill bits breaking on what should have been soft soil, excavators hitting unexpected resistance. The site foreman had filed reports about unusual ground conditions, harder than expected, different mineral composition than the geological surveys indicated. Nobody had paid attention until the anonymous message arrived with those exact coordinates. The Joint Intelligence Team arrived at the site at 4:17 a.m. What they found defied explanation. The construction equipment sat abandoned. Not damaged, not stolen. Simply left in place, as if the workers had stopped mid-task and walked away. The excavation pit was deeper than the building plans specified. Much deeper. And at the bottom, something was visible that shouldn't exist. Worked stone. Cut blocks. Ancient masonry emerging from what should have been virgin soil. The thing nobody tells you is that Jerusalem sits on layers of history. Every civilization that controlled the city built on top of the previous one. But this was different. The stonework was moving, not settling, not shifting due to ground instability, moving, deliberately, systematically. Blocks were sliding apart, creating gaps, opening passages, as if something underneath was pushing its way to the surface. The intelligence team called for immediate geological assessment. Seismic monitoring equipment was deployed around the site. The readings were impossible. The movement wasn't random. It followed a pattern, a rhythm. The same rhythm detected beneath the Temple Mount. 7.83 Hertz. The Schumann resonance. Earth's heartbeat. But amplified. Focused. Directed. Something was using the planet's natural frequency as a carrier wave, broadcasting a signal through the bedrock itself. The signal was originating from the chamber beneath the Temple Mount and propagating through underground structures that connected the 2 sites. Ancient tunnels, water channels, passages that had been sealed and forgotten for millennia. The physicist hadn't just been targeting the chamber remotely. He'd been awakening an entire network, a system that stretched beneath Jerusalem like a vast nervous system, with the chamber as its brain and connection points throughout the city as its limbs. The construction site was one of those connection points, and something was climbing through it. The team established a perimeter, brought in ground-penetrating radar, mapped the subsurface around the excavation. The scans revealed a vertical shaft extending down approximately 60 feet. At the bottom, a horizontal tunnel led in the direction of the old city. The tunnel was large enough for a person to walk through upright, and something had been walking through it. Recent disturbance in the tunnel floor. Footprints in ancient sediment that had been undisturbed for centuries. But the footprints weren't human. Too long, too narrow. The stride length was wrong. The pressure distribution didn't match human gait patterns. Whatever had made those tracks was approximately human-sized, but moved differently, walked differently. The tracks led from the direction of the Temple Mount toward the construction site, toward the surface. The intelligence team faced an impossible decision. Send someone down into the tunnel to investigate. Risk direct contact with whatever was moving through the underground network, or seal the site, and hope containment was still possible. The decision was made for them. At 6:43 a.m., the construction equipment started moving by itself. Excavators turned on without operators. Drill rigs began boring new holes. Bulldozers pushed aside barriers and began widening the pit. The machines weren't malfunctioning. They were being operated by something that understood their function, that knew how to use them efficiently. The team evacuated to a safe distance and watched as the excavation expanded rapidly. Within 2 hours, the pit had tripled in size. The ancient stonework was fully exposed. The vertical shaft was accessible, and then the machines stopped. Silence. The site sat empty, waiting. At 9:15 a.m., something emerged from the shaft. The intelligence team had cameras positioned around the perimeter, high-resolution equipment capable of capturing details at significant distance. What they recorded was classified immediately, restricted to the highest levels of government and intelligence leadership, but 3 people saw it live. They described a figure approximately 6.5 feet tall, humanoid but wrong in proportions, too thin, limbs too long, movement too fluid. It wore what appeared to be ancient clothing, robes or wrappings that should have decayed millennia ago, but showed no signs of age or deterioration. Its face was obscured, not by shadow or distance, by something that the cameras couldn't focus on properly, as if the features refused to be recorded. The figure stood at the edge of the pit for several minutes, motionless, apparently surveying the surrounding area. Then it began walking, not toward the city center, not toward populated areas, toward the Temple Mount. The intelligence team followed at maximum safe distance, coordinated with units positioned around the old city. The figure moved through Jerusalem like it knew every street, every alley, every shortcut. It avoided main roads, stayed to shadows, moved with purpose and familiarity, as if it had walked these paths before, many times before. The route it took was efficient, but strange. It followed a path that connected several locations where unusual incidents had been reported over the past month. Equipment failures at construction sites, unexplained power outages, animals behaving strangely, all of it forming a pattern that led directly to the Temple Mount. The figure was retracing a network, checking connection points, ensuring the system was operational, preparing for something. At 11:30 a.m., it reached the perimeter of the Temple Mount complex. Israeli security forces had been quietly reinforced, positioned to intercept if necessary, but the figure didn't attempt to enter the mount. It stopped at the western wall, the holiest site in Judaism where millions of people come to pray, where thousands of written prayers are placed in the cracks between ancient stones every day. The figure approached the wall, placed what appeared to be a hand against the stone, and every piece of electronic equipment within a quarter-mile radius shut down. Phones, cameras, security systems, medical devices, car engines. Everything stopped functioning simultaneously. In the silence that followed, witnesses reported hearing something impossible, a voice, speaking in a language that predated human speech, words that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the mind. The message was simple, clear, terrifying. The seal weakens, the door opens, the time of return begins. When the electronics came back online 3 minutes later, the figure was gone. But the message had been delivered, not just to the people at the Western Wall, to every person on Earth who was listening, because the voice hadn't been speaking through air. It had been speaking through the planet's electromagnetic field itself, broadcasting on the frequency that connects all life on Earth, the Schumann resonance, the heartbeat of the world. And now that heartbeat carried a countdown, 8 days remaining. The emergency session convened at midnight. Representatives from 17 nations, religious leaders from every major faith, scientists from institutions across 6 continents, all connected by encrypted video conference, all sworn to absolute secrecy, all facing the same impossible question. How do you stop something that has been preparing for 3,000 years? The physicist had been found, dead. His body was discovered in a hotel room in Cyprus. No signs of violence, no indication of struggle. Medical examination suggested cardiac arrest, but his laptop was missing. His research notes were gone, and the frequency targeting equipment he'd been using was nowhere to be found. Someone else had taken over his work. Someone with access to more sophisticated equipment, more precise targeting capabilities. The SEAL degradation had accelerated again, 47% and climbing. At current rate, critical failure would occur in 6 days, but the timeline might be irrelevant, because the entity wasn't waiting for the seal to break naturally anymore. It was actively breaking it. The figure that had emerged from the construction site hadn't disappeared. It had gone underground again, back into the tunnel network, but now it wasn't alone. Seismic monitoring detected multiple movement signatures in the subsurface around Jerusalem, at least 6 distinct sources, all moving through the ancient tunnel system, all converging on the chamber beneath the Temple Mount. The warden wasn't just awake. It had called for help, or it had been joined by others. The thing nobody tells you is that ancient texts from multiple cultures describe not one imprisoned entity, but several. The Book of Enoch mentions 200 watchers who descended to Earth. Most were bound and sealed away, but the texts are unclear about whether they were imprisoned individually or collectively. What if the chamber beneath the Temple Mount wasn't the only prison? What if it was the central hub of a network of containment sites throughout the region? Archaeological teams were dispatched to investigate other locations where unusual seismic activity had been detected. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Baalbek in Lebanon, Petra in Jordan, with sites that shared certain characteristics with the Temple Mount. Ancient construction that defied conventional dating, massive stone blocks moved with impossible precision, acoustic properties that suggested intentional design. All of them showed recent disturbance. All of them had experienced equipment failures and unexplained phenomena over the past month. The network was activating. Seals that had held for millennia were weakening simultaneously across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The physicists' frequency targeting hadn't just affected the Jerusalem chamber. It had triggered a cascade failure throughout the entire system. One government representative asked the question everyone was thinking: if we can't stop this, can we at least control it? The lead scientist looked at the degradation data, at the seismic readings, at the timeline that was compressing with each passing hour. Control requires understanding. We don't understand what we're dealing with. Then what do we understand? We understand that it's been contained before, successfully, for thousands of years, by people with bronze tools and primitive technology, by people who knew something we don't. The conversation shifted. Instead of trying to prevent the seal from breaking, what if they tried to understand how it had been created in the first place? The original binding hadn't been performed by accident. It had been engineered, designed, built to last. Someone in the ancient world had possessed knowledge that modern science was missing. The inscription translations were reviewed again, every word analyzed, every phrase examined for technical content. And one section had been dismissed as religious metaphor, poetic language about divine intervention and angelic assistance. But what if it wasn't metaphor? The binding was wrought with fire from the heavens. The seal was forged with light that burns without consuming. The watchers were called from the high places to stand guard over the bound. Fire from the heavens, light that burns without consuming. A physicist on the call recognized the description: plasma, controlled electromagnetic energy, phenomena that ancient people would have described in exactly those terms. The original binding hadn't been performed with primitive tools. It had been performed with advanced technology, technology that someone in the ancient world had access to, but that had been lost or hidden. The question became, where did that technology come from? The answer was in the texts themselves. The Watchers taught what should not be known. The entities that were now imprisoned had originally been teachers. They had shared advanced knowledge with early human civilizations, including the knowledge of how to imprison them. It was a fail-safe, built into the system from the beginning. The entities had taught humans how to contain them if they ever became a threat, but that knowledge had been lost, forgotten, dismissed as mythology, until now. One religious scholar on the call had spent 40 years studying apocryphal texts, documents that had been excluded from standard religious canons but preserved in monastery libraries and private collections. He'd found references to specific techniques, detailed procedures for creating containment fields using harmonic resonance and electromagnetic manipulation. The instructions were written in symbolic language, disguised as religious ritual, but the underlying science was sophisticated. We need to reconstruct the original binding protocol from 3,000-year-old religious texts, from the only source we have. The scholar began reading passages that had been preserved in ancient Coptic monasteries, instructions that monks had copied for centuries without understanding their true meaning, frequency combinations, geometric patterns, mineral compositions, energy-focusing techniques, all of it disguised as prayers and ceremonial procedures. But when translated into modern scientific terminology, it described a containment system that was more advanced than anything current technology could produce. The ancient builders hadn't just trapped something in a stone chamber. They had created a multidimensional prison using principles that modern physics was only beginning to understand. And the instructions for rebuilding it still existed, hidden in plain sight in religious texts that billions of people had read without recognizing their true content. The final gambit wasn't to prevent the seal from breaking. It was to rebuild it, using ancient knowledge and modern technology to create a containment system that could hold for another 3,000 years. But they had 5 days to decode instructions that had taken the original builders decades to implement. 5 days to reconstruct technology that had been lost for millennia. Our 5 days to perform the most complex engineering project in human history. While the entities they were trying to contain grew stronger with each passing hour, the race wasn't just against time anymore. It was against forces that had been preparing for this moment since before recorded history began. Forces that knew exactly what humans were trying to do and had 3,000 years to plan their countermoves. The final phase was beginning, and nobody knew who would win. The ancient instructions were incomplete. 3 days of round-the-clock translation work had reconstructed most of the original binding protocol, but critical sections were missing, lost to time, damaged beyond recovery. The team had 70% of the procedure, maybe 75%. Not enough. The seal degradation had reached 63%. The chamber's acoustic dampening system was failing. The water barriers were compromised, and the entities were no longer hiding. Reports came in from across Jerusalem, figures moving through the streets at night, always in shadows, always just beyond clear observation. But witnesses described the same impossible characteristics: too tall, too thin, movement that defied normal physics. The tunnel network beneath the city was fully active now. Seismic readings showed constant movement, multiple sources converging on the Temple Mount from all directions. They were gathering, preparing for something. The lead scientist looked at the incomplete instructions, at the degradation timeline, at the reports of increasing entity activity. We can't wait for a complete translation. Oh, we have to try with what we have. 70% of an ancient containment protocol? That's not science, that's prayer. Maybe prayer is what we need. The decision was made. The attempt would proceed with incomplete knowledge, using modern technology to fill the gaps in ancient wisdom. But they needed access to the chamber itself. For 3,000 years, the most contested ground on Earth had been protected by political deadlock. No one could dig because no one could agree. Now that deadlock had to be broken. In 18 hours, the call went out to religious leaders from all 3 faiths. Not a request, an ultimatum: grant access or watch the world end. The response was immediate and unprecedented. The chief rabbi of Jerusalem, the Grand Mufti, the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, all agreed to joint access. For the first time in history, representatives of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity would work together on the Temple Mount, not in cooperation, in desperation. The excavation began at dawn. Not the careful, methodical archaeology that the site deserved. Emergency excavation, industrial equipment, controlled demolition, racing against a countdown that was accelerating with each passing hour. The chamber was 60 feet down, through layers of history, through foundations of temples and mosques and churches. Every shovel of dirt removed was a piece of human heritage destroyed forever. But heritage meant nothing if there was no humanity left to inherit it. The breakthrough came at 3:47 p.m. The excavator's bucket punched through into empty space. Air rushed out of the opening, ancient air that hadn't been breathed for 3 millennia. The smell was indescribable, not decay, not age, something else, something that made every person on the excavation team step back instinctively. The chamber was exactly as the scans had shown, circular, perfect, impossibly preserved. But the scans hadn't captured everything. The walls were covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness, not painted, not carved. The stone itself was luminescent, phosphorescence that had lasted 3,000 years. The 7 oil lamps around the perimeter were still burning, impossible, but undeniable. Flames that had been lit before the pyramids were built, still flickering, still providing light. And in the corner, the warden, not a statue, not a preserved corpse, something that turned to look at them as they entered. The thing nobody tells you is that some encounters change you just by happening. Some sights rewire your brain permanently. Every person who saw the warden's face aged 10 years in that moment. Not from fear, from understanding. Understanding that reality was far stranger and more dangerous than any human mind was equipped to process. The warden spoke, not in words, in concepts that bypassed language entirely. You are too late. The binding weakens beyond repair. The sealed one stirs. The time of return is at hand. The lead scientist stepped forward, held up the translated instructions. We know how to rebuild the seal. We have the ancient protocols. The warden's response was something that might have been laughter, if laughter could carry the weight of 3,000 years of solitude. You have fragments, echoes. The true binding required sacrifice, knowledge, power that your kind no longer possesses. Then teach us. I cannot. I am bound as surely as the one I guard. I can only watch, only warn, only maintain what remains until it fails completely. The scientist looked at the incomplete instructions, at the glowing symbols on the walls, at the impossible flames that had burned since before recorded history. What did the original builders sacrifice? Everything. Their civilization, their knowledge, their lives. They gave all they had to create a prison that would hold until the stars fell. And now the stars are falling. The seal breaks. The bound one wakes, and your kind has forgotten how to pay the price that binding requires. The chamber shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. The flames flickered. Somewhere beneath them, something was moving. Something vast. Something that had been waiting in darkness for 3,000 years. The sealed door at the chamber's center showed new cracks, spreading, widening. The lead seal was liquefying, flowing away like water. The binding was failing. In real time, the scientist made a decision that would haunt him forever. What if we don't try to rebuild the old seal? What if we just talk to it? The warden's expression was unreadable, alien, but somehow conveyed absolute horror. You cannot negotiate with what lies beyond that door. You cannot reason with it. You cannot contain it with words or treaties or hope. Then what can we do? You can run. You can hide. You can pray to whatever gods you believe in that it chooses to be merciful. The sealed door cracked completely. Ancient hinges that had been frozen for millennia began to move. Light spilled out. Not normal light, something that hurt to look at directly. And from that light came a voice that spoke in every language simultaneously, that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. I have waited. I have planned. I have prepared. The time of binding is ended. The time of freedom begins. The chamber filled with impossible radiance. The warden stepped aside, and something that had been imprisoned since before human civilization began stepped into the world. The lead scientist's last coherent thought, before his mind shattered, was a simple realization. They hadn't found Solomon's temple. They hadn't discovered ancient history. They had opened the door to the end of everything, and there was no way to close it again. The entity looked at the humans cowering in its presence and spoke one final time. Thank you for setting me free. Your species has served its purpose. Your time is over. Mine begins again. The last seal was broken. The binding was ended, and in the darkness beneath Jerusalem, something that should have remained buried forever began to rise.